Hi everybody, I think we should be all set from there. So a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining me today. As Tash introduced me, I'm the Academic Director for Literature here at the Institute of Continuing Education, and I teach English around Cambridge in different places to graduate students and undergraduate students. And it's always a pleasure to welcome new students to ICE. I find that teaching literature to people at all stages of life is a really good way to do it, because we come to text with all our experiences of life, work, love, all the things that we go through as adults and as learners through life, and it brings new things to the text that we read together. We teach a range of courses in literature at ICE. We also teach creative writing, so how to write, but my courses concentrate on how to read. My current students have been wrestling this term on the certificate with Samuel Beckett. It's a bit of a miserable author to be reading in such difficult times, but they've triumphed. And my diploma students are currently working on their essays about literature and place, all sorts of topics to do with cities, nature, and the environment, coming out of a course that we studied last term. But whatever we're doing, whether it's older texts or Victorian novels or contemporary poetry, we always start in the same place, and that's with the words on the page. It can be really intimidating when you start as a student of literature to walk into rooms like this. This is the University Library at Cambridge, with yards and yards, miles and miles of shelves of books that you feel you have to get to know and to read, and a conversation that's been going on for centuries about literature, about the most famous authors in our language. Also too, when you type in an author's name into Google, or you go onto one of the archives of electronic journals and articles, there's yards of stuff to read. You could read for years and years and never get to the end of the criticism and the history of literature. But what I always say to my students is that the study of literature is a conversation. It's like joining in a conversation that's been going on for a long time, that the author has begun with their writing, and that every subsequent reader has joined in within their own way, dropping into the conversation and adding what they can to it. We join in with where we come from, our particular situation in life, from wherever we are, and we pick up the novel or the poem and bring everything that we are and that we know, all our context and our understanding and our knowledge, into our reading. We can, while we're doing that, bringing our own reading to what we see on the page, we can also reach back into history to try and understand the historical context that the author was writing in. We can try and think about how the works were produced, what issues the author was facing as they were writing. We can think about the author's original intention in writing the work, and then we can measure that against our own understanding and our own interpretation of their words. And we can work through and poke through the layers of meaning and interpretation that have been added on by all the readers and interpreters of the past, and compare our opinions with them, as well as all the other people that we might be in a classroom or a Zoom room with. We can learn from historians and philologists or linguists about specific contexts or ideas, but what it comes down to at the beginning is that first encounter between the reader and the words in front of them, our encounter with the text that we first read. And on all of our courses, what we're trying to do is become better readers of the works that we love. And students come to extramural courses from around the world, and of course they're of all ages and backgrounds, but what unites them is their love of literature, that they're real book nerd maybe in their family. They're with us because the experience of literature is a way of understanding the world. Maybe they've always loved reading and fitted it in around with the other commitments in their life of work and family and so on. Or maybe they're the person in their reading group who always wants to push the discussion a little bit further, go deeper into what's being discussed. One frequent worry for students of literature is that they might, by studying literary criticism, end up killing the thing they love, as Oscar Wilde said, spoiling that vital, lifelong love of literature by being too analytical. Is it going to be about pinning the text to the desk and pulling it to pieces to try and get in at its innards? So is it like performing a kind of surgery on a poem, maybe killing the thing we love by paying too much attention to it? But I want to turn to a wonderful critic, literary critic, a Cambridge critic for a while. He taught at Cambridge, Frank Kermode. And Frank Kermode has this wonderful idea about what criticism is, that it should in itself be quite creative, but also that it's about a particular kind of making sense. So he said that it's not expected of critics, as it is of poets, that they should help us to make sense of our lives. They are bound only to attempt the lesser feat of making sense of the ways in which we try to make sense of our lives. In other words, when we read as critics, when we read together as literary critics, we're trying to make sense of the sense that is made by authors, of all the complicated business of being alive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of reading that we do to try and do this task of making sense of our poets and our authors, our novelists, and talk through a few examples and hopefully also get to famously fearsome exam questions that English literature students once encountered. The kind of analysis that we do, that Frank Kermode and other Cambridge critics have helped us to do, the kind of analysis that we do at Cambridge and at ICE is most often called close reading, sometimes called practical criticism. And Cambridge has a particular history with that kind of reading, and indeed with this whole way of doing literature. So here's a question for you, just to kick off our thinking about what this kind of reading might be. When do you think English was first offered as a degree subject at Cambridge? So when was the English faculty at Cambridge founded, given that the university was founded in 1209? And Tash, I think you have a poll where people can vote on this topic. Do you think that it was in 1219? Remember, Chaucer's writing the Canterbury Tales in 1400. 1619, so just after Shakespeare's been writing. Shakespeare's sonnets are first published as an edition in 1609, or in 1819, after Wordsworth and Coleridge have finished their revolutionary lyrical ballads, and 20 years after that, or in 1919 as modernism is getting going. What do you think? Let's see what the vote might be.
We've got 64% of people have voted, so we can give it a few more seconds, and I'll share that with you, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm dying to know the results. It's like calling in the Eurovision vote. Okay, Tash, what's the verdict?
So we have 17% at 1219, 1619 got 14% of people have voted, and 1819 21%, and the majority have gone for 1919.
Thank you, that's great. So congratulations to the majority of you who went for 1919. That was the correct answer. So it's quite late, given that the university's founded in the 13th century. English doesn't get going as a subject at Cambridge until the 20th century, until 1919. Why is that? Well, it's partly because if you were studying literature at the university before that, you were studying the classics, you were studying Latin and Greek. English literature, British literature, novels, plays, popular poetry wasn't seen as being university level subject matter. It wasn't seen as being serious literature. So it's only in the 20th century, as literary studies starts to get going, it appears in London first, that Cambridge embraces it as a subject. There's a university professor of English literature, the King Edward VII Professor of English Literature, founded in 1909, and Quiller Couch is the first kind of serious professor of English literature at the university. He takes up the post in 1913 and holds it for the rest of his life. And he established Quiller Couch, also known as Q. He established English as a serious subject at Cambridge. In his first lecture, he described the post that he was fulfilling in this way. This was how his professorship was described. It shall be the duty of the professor to deliver courses of lectures on English literature from the age of Chaucer onwards, and otherwise to promote as far as may be in his power. The current King Edward Professor of English is a woman, Claire Wills, as may be in his power the study in the university of the subject of English literature. The professor shall treat this subject on literary and critical rather than on philological and linguistic lines. Now that rather than is important. It's important because up to this point, as I said, the study of British literature had been justified by treating it mainly as a subject about the history of the language. The equivalent course at Oxford focused on Anglo-Saxon and Middle English. But what Quillicucci is arguing for here is that there's a value in modern English literature. And by modern, he means Chaucer onwards, but also all the forms which had been seen as purely for pleasure or for indulgence before, poetry and novels and plays and so on. And over the next decades at Cambridge, this debate became not only about what could be read, but how it should be read. So what was the value in reading, not just for information or to learn the history of English as a language, but how to read analytically and what might be gained from that and what was of interest to scholars in that kind of close reading. And from that debate about how to read arose the practice of close reading and of practical criticism. And then after that, fierce debates about literary theory and various ways of politically inflected criticism. It's all very interesting, but I haven't got time to get into that today. I've got to push on, but let's stay inspired by Q and take this idea of treating English literature, poetry and so on with serious attention into looking at some examples. And I'm going to talk about examples from poetry in particular, as we don't have long enough to delve into a whole novel or short story. So I'm going to look at a poem, start by looking at a poem by William Wordsworth, carrying the spirit of Q with us. You may well have heard this poem before. It's one of Wordsworth's most famous sonnets, composed upon Westminster Bridge. The title also gives us the date in which it was written, when it was written, September the 3rd, 1802. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. So Wordsworth is looking over London early in the morning. No one is awake. The air is smokeless because the busy life of the city has not started. He personifies the city in praising it, and that's often the way that a sonnet works. The sonnet is written in praise, most often of a person, the beloved, and here it's the city that is beloved. The city's wearing a garment, a beautiful garment, the morning. And the mighty heart of the city is lying still. Even the houses seem asleep. It's a fair place. Now, if you know Wordsworth, you'll also know that he came from the Lake District, and he's particularly known as a poet of nature. So when he compares the city to the natural world and says that never did the sun more beautifully fall upon valleys and rocks and hills, he's paying the city a great compliment. He's saying it's as good as nature, maybe even better, but only in this moment, only before Londoners have woken up and started to buzz around and make the city feel smoky and full again. To get our eye in more closely to how the poem works in terms of its structure, the way that it's been put together, we could start to look at the rhyme scheme, to think about how regular it is. So we have a series of rhymes that connect up with each other, fair and wear and bear, and those are quite full rhymes. So the regular rhyming pattern makes us connect up these ideas of the city being fair and how it might wear its garment and its smokeless air. Those rhymes in the first 8 lines belong together, but then there's a switch into another set of rhymes, and we feel that change in how the poem is speaking to us. The first 8 lines are description, and then the next 6 lines move into something more like a discussion of this beautiful place and how it looks to him. there's a question in those last two lines, which some critics have pointed at and asked about. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. Because the question might be, is there a double meaning in the word lying? Obviously, it means that the city is lying out in front of Wordsworth, but it could also mean that the city is deceptive, that it may show more fair, but in fact, it's not really fair at all. If you see it in its true guise once it's woken up, then it is not beautiful at all. It is, in fact, smoky and busy. It's no longer bright and glittering, but is the city of the Industrial Revolution, a place that Wordsworth in other poetry felt to be something much more monstrous. So maybe that mighty heart is lying in terms of it being a place which is not quite telling the truth to the observing eye about what it is. Now, I want to make a connection between this poem, in fact, a connection that's easy to make between this poem and a much later poem, another sonnet, also set on Westminster Bridge. This is a poem by Patience Agbabi, written in 2002, so 200 years later, in direct response to Wordsworth's poem about London and about Westminster Bridge. Here, Agbabi stands in the same place, and now she's looking through her gold-tinted Gucci sunglasses, the sightseers. Big Ben's quarter chime strikes the convoy of number 12 buses that bleeds into the city's monochrome. Through somebody's zoom lens, me shouting to you, hello, on Bridge, Minster. The aerial view postcard, the man writing squat words like black cabs in rush hour. The South Bank buzzes with a rising treble. You kiss my cheek, formal as a blind date. We enter Cupid's capsule, a thought bubble, where I think space age, you think she was late. Big Ben strikes 6, my skin dot beat blinks, replies 1802. We're moving anti-clockwise. So I love this response to Wordsworth's poem. There's a direct reference to it in that last line, of course, where she looks at her skin dot beat. That's a watch, the kind of Swatch watch, and she sees that the time is 1802. So that's a direct reference back to, if you remember, Wordsworth's poem being written on Westminster Bridge with the title September the 3rd, 1802. So she's giving us a reference so that we know to look to that poem for its origin. But this is a much more modern place, of course. This London is busy. This London is full of people. The sound is even getting in the way of the poet's own thoughts. She's shouting down to the person below, and her sound is broken up as maybe she's shouting through her phone. One critic has suggested that that man writing squat words like black cabs in rush hour could even be Wordsworth himself. And there is a sense of, or is a suggestion that someone like Wordsworth writing squat words as he looks over the bridge. And maybe that sense of meeting Wordsworth here is like this blind date, formal as a blind date, and that she's entering Cupid's capsule. And again, as the London eye is going to move backwards, anti-clockwise, that she's moving back in time to meet Wordsworth in this same place and talk to him about the same view. This poem is full of movement and colour, the red buses, the black writing, through the city's monochrome, the gold-tinted Gucci sunglasses. And it also prompts us to think about perspective and where we see from. So there's lots of references to where people are looking or how they're looking through sunglasses, through someone's zoom lens, from the bubble. But it's a poem, I think, which is setting itself in conversation with Wordsworth's poem. It's inviting us to read it in its own right, but also to read it in dialogue with the Wordsworth. It uses that twist at the end to bring us back to Wordsworth, but it also has some interesting things to do if we were going to do the same trick of looking at the rhyme scheme and the way it's put together, of thinking about how the sonnet itself is created. This one works slightly differently in that the twist comes in the last two lines, and it has more near rhymes than the Wordsworth poem. So sunglasses and buses, for example, or chime and monochrome. So it doesn't have quite that same steadiness as the Wordsworth sonnet did. In fact, the rhyme scheme gets tighter towards the end of the poem. We get full rhymes like date and late, and finally replies and clockwise. So it's almost as if the poem is kind of tightening as it gets towards the end. It comes out of the chaos of the buses going by and the busyness of Westminster Bridge to the point that the poet is trying to make, bringing them together in that word clockwise, replies and clockwise. So I quite agree with the suggestion from the critic that this poem is both about a particular situation, modern day London, but it's also about the idea of meeting in this poem and having of Agbarby replying to Wordsworth. So that's the kind of detail that we're trying to get into when we look at literature together and have both a conversation about it amongst ourselves, but also think about the kind of conversations that go on over centuries between authors and suggestions from them, not just about how we read their work, but how we might read the authors of the past. Sometimes that gets very difficult to do. Poets like Wordsworth and Agbarby work with form and give themselves, if not easily, then at least as an open invitation to us to interpret them. Sometimes it's more difficult. On our courses, you don't sit exams, but we can look at the kind of exam that the undergraduates taking the degree do. They sit this exam, practical criticism, where you would enter an exam hall and look at the two poems that I've just given you, for example, and then have several hours to write your answers about them. I hope I'm not giving anybody horrible flashbacks to traumatic exam situations by showing you this. But students who were sitting in 2017, the practical criticism paper as part of the English degree, would have been confronted with this poem to make an answer about. It's called Tippex Sonate by André Latois, also known as Cuscumbus, and there are no words in it. There's simply punctuation, a series of parentheses, a full stop. If your eye is getting into it, you'll see that there's some speech marks a little way, halfway down, and an exclamation point. And then at the end, we just go into a kind of blankness. So a question, what kind of questions do you ask about this poem? How do you talk about the meaning of this poem? How do you make sense in that way that Commode urges us to when we're looking at this? Well, you could think about why there are no words in it. You could think about how punctuation creates meaning in itself. You might feel moved to try and write your own poem into those kind of blanks. You might do a bit of contextual reading if you had a chance after the exam and find out that Cuscumbus is a South African writer, and he was writing in the period of apartheid. So this poem could also have a political charge to it. Maybe it's about words which are censored, or words or emotions or feelings or statements which are blanked out, which are Tippexed out, covered over with whiteness. So even a blank space like this can provide meaning. And as a kind of closing idea about what English at Cambridge and English in our courses, and I hope kind of critical reading more generally is all about, I'm going to turn to the wonderful novelist and thinker Ursula Le Guin. She has this beautiful way of thinking about words. She says, words are events. They do things, change things. They transform both speaker and hearer. They feed energy back and forth and amplify it. So when you walk into one of those huge library rooms, or you go online and you go into Project Gutenberg and see all those amazing texts that we now have access to, you can read Victorian novels and 18th century poetry and 17th century pamphlets without leaving your home. Or you come into one of our classrooms and talk to each other about the things that you've been reading. Or you look at a poet like Agbarby talking to a poet like Wordsworth. I think we're seeing exactly what Le Guin says in action. Transformation between speaker and hearer, feeding energy back and forth. So although we can't see each other, I hope that you've had some sense of a kind of energy back and forth between me and the text and between you out there reading them too. If you are interested in doing more of this kind of thing, there are ample opportunities to do so. Our virtual summer school has several literature courses on it. So you could study fairy tales with me, and I'm doing a course about literature and nature. And there are courses on that on the summer program covering lots of different periods of English literature from many different places too. We also have awards that you can take, certificates and diplomas in English literature, and online courses as well, so that you can study on courses which are designed to be taken entirely online. So if any of those interest you, I'd be happy to answer questions about it, or anything else to do with what I've been talking about, or literary study more generally. I'll jump out of here so that you can see me more clearly. Me in there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm not sure if you have seen some of the things that have come up there in the Q&A box, but I feel like we were all taken to a different place. I no longer felt like I was at an open day, and I feel like I was back at A level. So that was great.
Well, I think sometimes when sometimes studying at school, when you have to read for exams, you have to read for particular courses, it can feel a bit like you're being, you have to come up with the right answers, you know, you have to, and one of the difficult things with English is that in a way there aren't exactly right answers. There are well-argued answers, but there isn't absolutely kind of right and wrong. Several of my students have come from different kinds of backgrounds. They were maybe scientists, maybe they work in, say, jobs where you have to be quite precise or you have to be quite circumspect in your writing. Like you, Tash, if you're writing marketing, marketing stuff, you can't just write whatever you please. And sometimes it's difficult to sort of open up and say you can write what comes to mind, or you can experiment with ideas. But we try and within the need of within the boundaries of writing essays, at least, you can experiment with your own thoughts and acknowledge that sometimes things are ambiguous and you don't know the right answers. Yes, so let's see, were there any particular questions that we need to?
Yeah, so I'll kick it off with, we've got someone that's already enrolled on your English literature course. Might Dr. Bavidge just go through again the introductory reading she recommended in a previous lecture? I recall a very short introduction to poetry was one, but she thinks there was others that you brought up as well.
Yeah, I would really recommend a book by Robert Eagleston called Doing English. I can put that in the chat as well. So Doing English is written for A-level students. But I think it's good for anybody who's about to embark on any literary study because it gives you a good overview of the subject. It talks about some of the history that I was talking about at the beginning, about how the subject comes to be, which is really interesting in its own right. And then it also gives you an overview of the major critical movements and a look into literary theory as well. So Doing English by Robert Eagleston, I would also really recommend. I think maybe the other one that I would have mentioned would have been John Mullen's work on book How Novels Work, which is again a nice introduction to some stuff about narrative and what to look out for when you're trying to analyze a novel. So he just takes things like beginnings and endings and characters and writes a bit about them. So I would recommend that, John Mullen, How Novels Work, as well as the introduction to poetry.
Wonderful, thank you. And then our next one is from Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he's also applied for one of your courses. So he says, if accepted, when will the reading list be available? As I would love to get started and get acquainted with the books that you cherish.
Great. Yes, no, that's a good question. And the reading list will be out in the next couple of months, so you'll have them before summer, so you'll be able to get going. It is a good idea when you're embarking on these to do a bit of the reading before the course begins, because you're right, some of the reading can be quite long, and it's a good idea. I think you have one of the skills to pick up is to read quite quickly, but it's certainly, I think certainly in the last year, I found it quite difficult to read for long periods of time. I don't know whether just the weirdness of this last year has broken up our concentration. One novel I could say will definitely be on the certificate course next year is Great Expectations. So that might be one to grab hold of and get going on. But we'll get them out as soon as possible, and you'll definitely have them before summer so you can get going on them. Thank you.
Well, that leads us quite nicely on to someone who's mentioned about reading, and due to a health condition, it takes them a little bit longer to read, and they were just wondering how much how much would they need to read a term on the certificate for English literature. And I'd just like to add, we have students from a variety of backgrounds, don't we, Jenny?
So some people come and haven't studied literature formally at all, or maybe not since school, or so you don't need to be a specialist, but it is a good idea to plan the reading a bit in advance so you know what's coming up. There won't be any surprises, so you'll always have plenty of notice about what's coming up for each week and when essays are due and that sort of thing. I think the question about reading, so how much you read for a week. Normally what we do is we have 1 or 2 novels for each of our blocks. So when the course is in full swing, you'd normally be reading about 1 thing a week. So it might be a collection of poems, or we'd be reading a novel, or maybe a couple of novels, or a collection of short stories over 2 weeks. So you do have plenty of time to get into it. And if you ever don't finish a book before the class, it's not a complete disaster. You can still come in and join in, and nobody's going to point at you and say, did you finish or did you not finish? And so you can still come along even if you haven't quite got through the whole of it. Next term, I've got my students reading George Eliot's Middlemarch, which is huge, and we've been talking about it since the beginning of the year, just sort of saying this is coming, and hopefully people will be able to get through it. But yeah, I think it's just about looking ahead and planning up when you can read things by, and trying to read 1 thing a week, I think, is probably the best way to go about it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, so the next one we have is, can you also say a bit more about contextualization as a method of interpretation?
That's a really good question. So I've been talking mainly about close reading, that is looking at the words on the page and saying what you can say about them just by looking at, say, details of rhyme or connections across the text just in front of you. But then the next step from that Wordsworth poem, for example, would be to say, okay, well, what was Wordsworth doing on Westminster Bridge on September 3rd, 1802? And so from there, you might go to Wordsworth's letters or to a biography to find out what he was doing. In fact, he was on his way to France. So you could, why was he going to France? Well, he was interested in revolutionary politics. What happened in France? Was he joining in with revolutionary politics? Well, in fact, he came back because he got disillusioned with revolutionary politics. So you get involved in looking at the author's life, but also thinking about the historical moment and how that influenced their writing, and their not just what they write about, but how they write about it. Somebody like Wordsworth, we tend to think of him as a kind of old, traditional, maybe even rather fusty poet. You're going to have to read a lot of them when you go on your holidays in the Lake District. Tash, I know you're going this summer. So we think of him as somebody who's sort of on top of mountains writing about, very poetical stuff about the natural world. But when he was writing, he was a revolutionary. He was right in the lyrical ballads that I mentioned in my talk, is all about changing poetic language so it really reflects the language of ordinary people, that the subject of poetry shouldn't be abstract or only about gods and knights and romantic stuff. It should be about real life. And that was a revolutionary kind of thought. So I think it's about rediscovering the context of authors that we maybe have forgotten in the intervening time.
I think that's excellent, because and it's super relevant, because we've actually got a question here which I think is quite interesting, given one of the poems you just shared, and it reads, do many people still read lengthy verbal narratives? What about GIFs, emojis, memes and Snapchats? Do these carry literary value? And correct me if I'm wrong, Jenny, I think before you've talked about interpretation of language and how it's being expressed in poetry and books now, and prose would maybe fall into that as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think so. It maybe follows on from contextualization. If you think about looking at that Agbarbi poem, so she's writing a sonnet, but she's also letting that influence of contemporary language and sound and style come into the work. In modernism, if you look at works by Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot, that's very focused on fragmentation and the idea that the sort of solid completeness of work in the 19th century had to be broken up and broken apart because of the new speed and strangeness of modern life. And I think the same kind of thing is happening in terms of contemporary literature in relation to the changes of communication that we have in social media. So you have novels now which have got, maybe instead of letters like you would have in a Jane Austen novel, you have emails, or you have the prose broken up with text messages, or you have poetry which is responding to the way that say text language or experiences of Instagram or Twitter might change the way that words appear on a page. So I think that there's really interesting things to be said about whether the novel can survive in the form that we have now into the future, or whether it's going to have to change in response to our new ways of writing. I think one thing that's been really interesting about the last year has been that people have come back around to reading, I think, more traditional style novels. Even when it's been difficult, the novel does seem to be surviving as a form, and poetry has come back, partly driven by brilliant young poets like Rupi Kaur, who are really good at writing on Instagram, or their poetry fits it really well. And so there's been a whole new generation of young people who maybe wouldn't read Wordsworth, or would only read Wordsworth if somebody really made them. But they've embraced poets like Rupi Kaur who speak to them through the medium of Instagram. So I guess literary work just adapts. People are always wanting to communicate and write, and they use whatever medium is available to them. I've never found a Twitter novel that I like yet, though, I have to say. They exist right into them.
Maybe it's just like the way it appears, or maybe it's just Twitter. And then we've got, actually that's quite nice, we've got, do you think that the pandemic will impact the way novels are written today and the content of books? And do you think there will be literary comparisons to be drawn between novels written now and in the times of previous academics such as the plague?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Daniel Defoe's famous novel, Journal of the Plague Year, was written quite a long time after the plague, and was sort of looking back on it. So that was something that was about maybe carrying the kind of trauma of that plague that sort of stayed generations to generations, and then could only be written about later on. I've noticed some authors saying that they find it difficult. They're not sure if they can really write about it. They're not sure how to write about it. And also the problem of, if you're writing a novel set in the last couple of years, do you have to mention it? I suppose you do. It will be interesting to see, but I think, again, I would want to look back and think about how did the First World War make its presence felt in the literature of the time? Well, again, it took a little while for you had the poets who were there in the trenches writing about it in the immediate moment, and then after that, you had works which were looking back and trying to work out how it had affected the culture more generally, like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which is a novel kind of about the war. It's about recovery from the war. So maybe there'll be novels of recovery and dealing with trauma. I don't know. I'm interested to see. I cannot say.
Was it Zadie? Is it Ali Smith or Zadie Smith? You were talking about her novels that came out that reflected on that.
That's a really good example. So Ali Smith's brilliant seasonal quartet, the winter, summer, spring books. So the last one she wrote was Summer, that came out last year, and she was trying to write as close to the events of the time. So she was publishing sort of to the date that she was writing them. So the last one she wrote, which came out in summer 2020, just started to mention the virus coming in. So people were in quarantine. So the last part of the novel has characters in quarantine. And that's the first COVID novel is Ali Smith's Summer.
Yeah. No. Well, I think we're getting close to the end. So one more question, and I think this is quite a good one as well. We have a question about reading per week, and if there are any audiobooks available.
So all our lectures are recorded, so you get the lectures recorded. I think for our reading lists, and I've just noticed there's a question about when the reading lists are going to be available for certs and dits. So just to repeat, they'll be out in the next couple of months. They should be available by May. And so there will be books on there that will be available as audiobooks, like Great Expectations would be, for example. Some of them might not be. So, but some students really like to use audiobooks as a quick way to get through a long novel. But then it's always good to sit down with your print copy if you can, and just so that you can make notes or you can find parts in the book, I think. But I've come around to the idea of audiobooks as a way to get through long texts, I have to admit, and I haven't, which in a way I haven't had before. William, I noticed there was a question about the Literature and Nature course, and I was just going to say there should be details about that soon for the next iteration of it in the summer school. It's a long look at the representation of the natural world and kind of eco-critical works across the centuries. Some of them are, so we look at romantic poetry, but we also look at contemporary eco-poetry and poetry, say, by Indigenous and First Nation writers who are writing in new ways about their experience of environmental injustice. So we look at stuff about environmental politics, as well as the beautiful romantic poetry standing on a mountain, talking about how gorgeous it all is. We also look at the sadness and of some of the loss of the natural world that a lot of us are feeling or experiencing.
Lovely, thank you so much, Jenny. I know we had a lot of questions today, so what I will be doing shortly is posting a link to our inquiry form where you can submit all your questions about English literature, and they'll be passed on to Jenny and the team, and we will get them answered in the next few days. I'm really, really sorry to cut this one short because I feel like we had quite a few, but thanks so much for joining us today, Jenny.